Our guest today is the president of G&L Strategies, which is affiliated with the Chicago firm of Golan Harris. She's the author of 3 books. My favorite is called Framing a Life. It's a book about family, a book about her mother particularly, who was she viewed as a role model, and it also reflects the warmth and vitality of her. She also served, I thought it was most fitting that the year she was nominated on a national ticket was the centennial of Eleanor Roosevelt's birth. And she, in the 1990s, served our country with honor and distinction as the U.S. ambassador to the UN Commission on Human Rights, and carried on Eleanor's legacy at the UN. If some of you watched Law and Order and its various things, they haven't done Law and Order traffic tickets yet, but they have on Law and Order on Friday night is about the special victims, and our guest headed in the 1970s the Special Victims Bureau in the Queens District Attorney's Office, dealing with such problems as child abuse, rape, domestic violence, and crimes against seniors. I first became aware of her when I've covered 10 national conventions, and many of them with my colleague Lynn Sweet. And in 1980, she introduced one of my favorite characters in American politics, a person I thought of as sort of the Will Rogers of the Democratic Party, the late Morris K. Udall, who was a wonderful human being. She, our guest, was in her first term in the U.S. House at that time, and later that year was elected, she was already a rising star and was elected Secretary of the Democratic Caucus, and she would later go on the Steering and Policy Committee, which is a most important committee if you want to go somewhere in the U.S. House, and she was someone who has a terrific had a terrific ability as a networker, and the sponsorship of my favorite House Speaker, the late Thomas P. Tip O'Neill. And she tackled issues ranging from problems we deal with in Chicago on airport congestion, which affected her congressional district in Queens, and reducing the disproportionate number of women and children on poverty. She also stood up and fought the first administration in the history of our country that sought to limit a woman's reproductive and constitutional right to choice and privacy. And then later, I covered her she was the chairman of the Democratic Platform Committee in 1984, and I got a phone call in the July of 1984 from my then managing editor at my former newspaper saying, we want you to go to St. Paul tomorrow because Walter Mondale's going to announce his choice of a running mate. We didn't know who that was going to be. And I'll tell you, it was a very emotional moment when beneath the portrait of Abraham Lincoln in the Minnesota House of Representatives, Fritz Mondale announced to the country that this is an exciting choice and this is history speaking. I saw my father's a World War II veteran, a guy with a VFW hat in the back of the hall with a tear in his eye, and it was really an electric moment. Later that day, we went to Elmore, Minnesota, Fritz Mondale's hometown, and then that weekend before the convention to Lake Tahoe. But the highlight, I think, of the 10 national conventions that I've covered was that week at the Moscone Center. The governor of her state, Mario Cuomo, gave the best keynote speech, I think, since Frank Clement here in Chicago in 1956. And then, how long, America? And then her appearance was an extraordinary event. I mean, you could feel the electricity when the lights went down and she came to the podium. It was an extraordinary moment. And she also, as a pioneer, had to put up with a lot, as Mayor Byrne did also. A lot of people in the news media are not used to dealing with women in positions like this. I can think of 2 news organizations that fall that seem driven more by their political agendas than a desire to inform. I also was most disappointed that at the religious right in their stalking of because of the one issue people, and the late John Cardinal O'Connor, who I think was a good man in many ways, did not distinguish himself that fall. But after the convention, there was an astounding what they call the convention bounce. The The Democratic ticket actually jumped ahead of the Republicans that year, although the outcome obviously was much different. It was an exciting fall because I traveled mostly with her running mate, Walter Mondale, but there were a number of occasions when they were together, and you would see people bringing their children out to see the ticket and to see her. And the only other campaigns I ever saw, anything like that, were Bobby Kennedy and that same year, Jesse Jackson in the South, in rural parts of the South. 1984 was an extraordinary year in so many ways. But one of the great events, in addition to bringing people out, she also brought people together. One of my favorite visuals that fall was with Ed Verdoliak, chairman of the Democratic Party, Harold Washington. At the Democratic Convention that year, Chicago got the nickname as Beirut on the Lake when Ed Bradley of CBS News asked Mayor Washington if he'd mind talking with Eddie Verdoliak on camera, and Mayor Washington did the dozens on Ed Bradley. But that fall, it was an amazing scene at Daley Plaza with the Democratic vice presidential nominee and both Chairman Verdoliak and Mayor Washington. And she also continued to have impact in the politics of our town when Congressman Dan Rostenkowski was in trouble in a Democratic primary in the early 1990s. Former Congressman Frank Annunzio his district had been eliminated. There was some ill will toward Rostenkowski in part of the Northwest side, and he was facing a very tough challenge. Our guest, at some inconvenience, changed her schedule, came in, walked precincts in the 36th Ward, and did another event that was critical in the renomination of Dan Rostenkowski, and he credits with helping him to win that very difficult primary. More recently, the people of the country and of the Congress were moved when she went public with an illness that she is battling. She went before the U.S. Senate committee in the summer of 2001, and because of her testimony helped obtain something like $250 million in funding for this, giving people hope across the country. And I think that the American people, the 1984 campaign was the only one I can remember in which a party ran ads for a candidate for vice president. The caption was, "We're proud of you, Jerry." I think that the American people still feel that way, and it's what an honor for the City Club. Jerry Ferraro.
Aren't you nice? Thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I asked for a little help because the only thing I have a problem with is I have no strength in my right leg. It has nothing to do with anything. I feel fine. I'm in remission. I'll get that out of the way. But I have a sciatic nerve that is just driving me nuts. So thank you, Steve, for that wonderful, wonderful introduction. I have to tell you, it is such a delight to listen to someone like that who really is a historian, because he remembers more about my campaign than I remember about the campaign. But I do, the fun thing listening to 1980 was I was just newly elected to Congress in 78, and then started work in 79. And who knew about national politics? I was the prosecutor, and got very involved. I used to be invited to the White House, the Carter White House, at 8 o'clock in the morning for strategy meetings. Don't ask me why, but I tried. I really tried to help them win. But in any event, my reward was being able to introduce Mo Udall at the convention. I have to tell you, if you come from Queens, no press pays any attention to you. That's right. None of the press ever paid any attention to me, right? Little district in Queens. And so all of a sudden, I'm going to be on national television introducing the keynote speaker. And I went out, got my hair done, I got a new outfit, I was all set. Said to my mother, make sure you watch. I'm coming on, that time when you're going to come on. And she's watching. I'm all excited. I get on, and I was only allowed 3 minutes. So I do my 3 minutes introduction, and I get off immediately, and I call up my mother, and I said, so what'd you think? She said, I didn't see you. And I said, why? She said, well, as soon as they said, and here's Geraldine Ferraro to introduce Mo Udall, they went to commercial. So that's one of those things that I have never gotten over, I want you all to know. But I am delighted to be here, and again, thank you, Steve, to speak to all of you. But before I do that, and let me just pick up on this hawking of a book. this is the first time that I've met Neil in person, though we may have met in 1984. But we have met on the phone, and it is because of Eleanor and Harry. You want to hold it up again? That book. Now, if you look at the back of that book, if you look at the jacket, on the very back is a quote from me, and the reason it's there is because I really did love it. For one thing, it is very easy to read. It's like snooping in somebody's correspondence, which is terrific. But the main reason I like the book is because I'm such an Eleanor Roosevelt fan. As a matter of fact, we did our debate in 1984 on her birthday. And I have a great poster of Eleanor on this side and me for commemorating the debate, which I won. But in any event, the reason I'm such an Eleanor is not only because of it, but I met Eleanor Roosevelt. I spoke to Eleanor Roosevelt. Now, I know there are some doubters here. I don't talk to her like Hillary does. That's her thing. And that's okay. But I really did speak to Eleanor Roosevelt when I met her at a small neighborhood event when I was a young attorney, newly married, and getting involved in local politics. She was tall, really tall, but her stature was more than her physical height. She was an imposing and impressive woman who cared more about the issues facing our country and the world than most people knew or appreciated. And Steve's book shows just how much President Truman valued her judgment and her concern for so many issues and valued her advice. So, if you haven't read Eleanor and Harry, go out, buy yourself, do yourself a favor. Say Merry Christmas or something and buy a copy. It really is superb. Steve Neal aside, however, I am happy to be back in Chicago today, run by a good friend, Mayor Richard Daley, a man whose understanding and love of the city can be felt almost as soon as you get into town. That's quite unlike what it was 20 years ago, as Steve mentioned. In 1984, the mayor, Harold Washington, with whom I had served in the Congress and who was a good friend, was having a rough time with Ed Verdoliak, a powerful and equally as headstrong leader. These two incredible Democrats, as Steve mentioned, were constantly battling each other. The Democratic Party was really concerned. There was no way you could win Illinois without winning Chicago. And in a national election, there was no way a Democrat could win the presidency without winning Illinois. So I, as the vice presidential candidate, was dispatched to heal the rift in the Democratic Party. I have to tell you, my visit produced my favorite newspaper headline of the entire campaign. It was Ferraro the Peacemaker. And there I stood between Harold Washington and Ed Verdoliak holding both of their hands up in the air. Now, I don't usually do a picture like that because I'm so short. I always look as if people are trying to string me up. But it was worth it. Of course, if you look closely at the picture, Ed's face was facing that way and Harold's face was that way, which I really didn't care because at least for my purposes, they were talking. Now, Chicago is also a city that my youngest daughter chose as her home after she graduated from college because, in her words, it is much younger and more livable than New York, Mom, I was told. And when I prayed that the wind chill factor driving temperatures way below zero would send her back home to us, she instead decided to quit her commute to work as a graphic designer and keep warm by staying inside and studying to become a doctor. Don't ask me why, and don't ask me how that happened, but in any event, that necessitated shifting gears, another round of tuition payments to Loyola first for 2 years to make up all the credits that she hadn't taken since 9th grade, and then to the University of Chicago Medical School. All's well that ends well. Laura is now a pediatrician, and for that I thank Chicago's weather. So you see, I know your city, and that alone is reason enough for me to be here, plus seeing my really old friends like Jane Byrne and so many of you here today. It's really a delight. But I'm also glad you suggested the title, Restoring Trust in a Post-Enron World. And I leapt at it because there is nothing I would rather talk about right now than trust in America's institutions. Unless, of course, you ask me about the Senate race in New Jersey. I am very eager to share some of my thinking with you because behind that title I see a far deeper set of questions which frame what is probably the single most important issues for Americans to confront if we are to survive as a nation. If those sound like strong words, I hope that as you hear me out in the next few minutes, you'll agree, and if you don't, after I deliver my 20 minutes of prepared brilliance, You'll tell me how you see it during the Q&A. Let me start by saying that when we talk about a post-Enron era, I think we are really using shorthand for something much more profound. We are, in fact, speaking of an entire era of shattered trust at many levels. For instance, an area that hits close to home for me, and I know you had, Steve mentioned, or you mentioned, the Cardinal was here a couple of weeks ago, and Father Greeley is coming in a couple of weeks. Here's the view of someone who is not part of the church hierarchy. Women aren't allowed, but who is a practicing Catholic. As you know, I am also a mother and a grandmother. I am also, as Steve mentioned, a former prosecutor who handled all the child abuse cases in Queens County in the 70s prior to running for Congress. And by the way, I didn't only work in that bureau and head it, I created it. And it became a model for bureaus all over the world. And do you think this guy, Dick Wolf, says to me, thank you for giving me that name for my show? Forget it. Because of my experience, my trust was hugely shaken last year with the unfolding problem of priests abusing kids and the cover-ups perpetrated by some in church leadership around it. I've been deeply shaken by the events surrounding my church, and I doubt I'm alone in that. That got me thinking about trust in a big way. Growing up in New York among Italians and Irish Catholics, I'm sure it was no different in Chicago, no one ever said anything bad about a priest. For one thing, you couldn't be entirely sure if that thing about being hit by lightning was true. But mostly, we kids and our parents trusted our church and its shepherds. Well, most of the parents did, except my mother. As the scandal started unfolding this year in Boston and elsewhere, I recalled a conversation I had long ago with my mother. I was about 7 years old and attending Mount St. Mary's School in Newburgh, New York. The school had a large campus, and to get to a piano lesson, one had to walk the equivalent of a short city block to a separate building. One day when I came home from school and was recounting everything that had gone on, I mentioned to my mother that on my way to my piano lesson, I had met Father Cahill and we had walked together. Now let me assure you that Father Cahill was a holy man of impeccable reputation. No one ever thought anything other than that. But when I told my mother about our walk, she said, Jerry, don't go anywhere with Father Cahill. I immediately reacted, but Mommy, he's a priest. She looked at me and said, wagging her finger in my face, as only an Italian mother can, a priest is still a man. Now, her words came back to me more than once this year. So many of us who care deeply about our faith ache to see the unfolding revelations of abuse, the widening waves of scare, and the cover-ups in local dioceses and city after city. Who could have imagined the calls for resignations of Cardinal Law and others, or envisioned several national coalitions of the faithful demanding justice? We've seen class action suits, multi-million-dollar settlements, and the sale of church buildings to pay legal bills. We've seen Time magazine and the Evening News carry stories of church hierarchies stonewalling and sweeping problems under the rug, protecting their own. With each disturbing revelation, trust was tarnished. And it wasn't only with the local people in authority, it went as far as Rome. Church leaders pointing fingers everywhere else, blaming 14-year-old girls for seduction in Boston, blaming parents, deliberately blurring the distinction between pedophiles, and homosexuals, to blame gay priests, blaming America's litigious citizenry, blaming our uppity American church. As the old saying goes, point your fingers and 4 fingers will point back at you. We faithful found ourselves counting too many deceptions, seeing too many shell games of moving proven abusers from parish to parish, heard of too many witch hunts, and too much hush-money settlements. At least in my faith this year, for a nation which proclaims, in God we trust, some of his representatives didn't make it easy. But that was just the first of our faiths that was tested in the last year. I know that every last one of us was deeply shaken by the events of September 11th. You don't have to live in New York or Washington to have felt it, or Pennsylvania. On that sunny, ghastly morning, America's trust was shaken as never before. Our trust in our safety, our security, our insularity from the horrors of terrorism that have so long gripped much of the world was shattered. Could we trust in our institutions to serve us, our intelligence to safeguard us, our military to protect us, our leaders to lead us? Could we trust in the resilience of the freedoms we take for granted to keep us safe from harm? For the first time, many of us did not know where, when, or whom to trust. With the anthrax poisonings that followed those attacks, it seemed to many their faith in institutions of America was shaken to its core. Now, in the last year, we have seen the series of crises of confidence of an entirely different type. Yes, we're in a post-Enron world, not to mention a post-global crossing world, a post-WorldCom/MCI world, a post-Arthur Andersen world, and a post-California energy fraud scheme world, and God knows what other corporations are in the headlines today. There have been so many that many of us could not even recall all the corporate frauds and schemes that have come to light in the last year. Does anyone remember the military procurement scandals and frauds in the 1980s? The savings and loan swindles that cost the economy hundreds of millions of dollars? Those pale by comparison. So now fast forward. This last month we are now embroiled in Tyco and GE. When Tyco shareholders are paying for $6,000 shower curtains and $2,200 waste baskets for the CEO, you start to yearn for the simple Reagan years when we taxpayers only paid $600 for toilet seats at DOD. If you put those things together, you've got quite a bathroom. All that's missing is a matching set of Martha Stewart accessories. Cancel that. It now turns out that she may be an accessory herself. This is not a good thing, Martha. I have to tell you a funny story later about Martha and her lawyer, who happens to be a friend of mine, and his lawyer's wife. So now somebody will ask about that, right? And each of these corporate debacles cost millions, some billions of public funds, taxpayer dollars, or investors' equity. All too often, they cost tens of thousands of working people their lives. They claim the retirement savings of hundreds of thousands of citizens. Florida state workers alone invested $300 million in Enron in its last month. That money is gone. And with it, the retirement savings of thousands of working people, people like many of us in this room. But the highest price tag on all of these is the erosion of trust. How do you tell an employee of Enron never again to trust their employer? How do you explain ever again to trust their employer? How do you explain to the thousands of people laid off at WorldCom why their jobs disappeared? We have learned to not even trust the guardians. Remember, Arthur Andersen and other auditing firms, can we trust that anyone is watching the watchers? Certainly not the regulators in the administration. This is hardly some abstract problem. I ask you to consider your own lives. How many of us have seen our savings, our 401k and retirement plans shriveled this year? We all have. The U.S. equities market took an historic loss. We've gone from irrational exuberance to a cascading crisis of confidence. The most recent plunges are now linked to the potential of war against Iraq. For that, we can blame government action, but the blame doesn't only lie with government. Investors have also taken huge losses in their investments because so many corporations have not been truthful in their financial reporting. It can't help but make one question the whole concept of privatizing Social Security. How can a working family with money and retirement plans rely on the private sector to invest for them if they can't believe their broker? And if the broker in turn can't trust the analysts? And if the analysts can't trust the auditors? I'm sure some of you have seen the recent Fortune magazine cover with all the CEOs who had sold stock in their corporations before its value plummeted. They sold, you didn't, was the headline. When Americans see a system rigged so that the privileged big investors get the hot tips and the CEOs get stock options and the shareholders left holding the bag, how can ordinary investors trust in those leaders and in that system? I dealt with this issue in a small way as a member of the Select Committee on Aging when I was in Congress. We, of course, were doing oversight of the Social Security Trust Fund, and many Republicans complained that the government was ridiculous in how it invested the money. If we allow people to invest their Social Security money in the stock market, they'll have a much better retirement, they argued. Why invest in bonds while the stock market is growing in leaps and bounds? The critics harped. Well, one broker in New York is now running a commercial that has an answer to that question. He says that he was told that investing in bonds rather than the stocks was like watching your grass grow. His response was, sure, but I'd rather watch my grass grow than watch my house burn down. So, whom do you trust? Economists tell us that weak consumer confidence is now actually working to independently undermine the economy. That's not surprising. The root of confidence is trust. Trust in America's future and principles. Trust in the honesty of our systems and citizens. Trust in the integrity of our institutions. Confucius once wrote that the treasure of a nation is its honesty. In America in 2002, we've seen the treasure rooms of honesty pillaged. And when people don't trust, the economic picture suffers. No wonder the experts say consumer confidence is heading further south than Florida's ballot boxes. And speaking of Florida, that raises the most sobering trust issue of all. How honest are our elections? Now, I know in the old days, Chicago and Tammany Hall in New York were known for registering and counting votes of those in everlasting peace at the local cemeteries. But this is the year 2000, and now 2002 we're talking about. Was Ari Weiss, a political appointee, correct when he said Al Gore, the man who won the popular vote in the presidential election over his boss, was irrelevant? Is that a comment on our political system? And I know the women who would get out the vote don't think so, and neither do I. For that matter, what happens to trust when the White House National Energy Plan gets drafted by the same players whom the Wall Street Journal reports propelled the California energy crisis? These companies, and Enron was not alone here, created an artificial crisis to inflate prices and sell energy that they did not have in a complex pyramid scheme. And all the while, they were helping to draft the president's national energy plan. How can citizens have confidence in a nation of corporate confidence games? Of course, none of us know exactly the details of this story its full magnitude because the vice president refuses to release the list of power companies that participate in the shadowy task force. Dick Cheney says the White House is entitled to keep their conversations and the advice they receive private, and I agree with him. No one, however, is asking for a transcript of those meetings. No one wants the detail of the conversation. What people are asking for is who was there? Who was the White House getting its advice from? And that they are not entitled to keep from the American people. The lack of trust can have life and death consequences for individuals as for a nation. 9/11 was the ultimate national test of trust in our safety, our leadership, and ourselves. Now we see increasingly disturbing questions raised about how much our intelligence services had advanced warning of those horrendous attacks. More than a few people are asking if we can trust what we are being told. All of which brings us to the present moment, when we face the real and immediate threat of war. As I've been watching the debate over whether or not to attack Iraq and remove Hussein, I keep going back to the days of the Cold War. It wasn't that long ago, so I'm surprised that no one seems to remember what it was like then. You will recall that the Soviet Union had weapons of mass destruction pointed at us which were capable of carrying out an immediate threat. We worried, but not excessively, because we had our weapons pointed at the Soviet Union. The deterrence of war was based on a principle called MAD, mutual assured destruction. And though we wanted a change in regime, we knew we could wait. Eventually, the Soviet Union imploded. Today, Saddam Hussein is smart enough not to use his weapons in a first strike because he knows that he'll be a dead man rather quickly. But if we launch unilaterally an attack preemptively with the express purpose of taking him out, changing the regime, what possible reason could he have to not launch every weapon he has at, say, Israel, whose border in some places is less than 600 miles away, or even give them to the terrorists? What reason would there be for the missiles which are now on the Lebanese border to stay there and not shoot off? Is that an irrelevant question to ask? Is it wrong for Tom Daschle as a leader of the Senate to see if there are any steps that could be taken to avoid conflict? I'm pleased to see that the administration has now decided to work with the UN to write a resolution to resume inspections and disarm those lethal weapons that we all know Saddam Hussein has. Would he have done that without the dissent being there? Is it asking too much for our president to lay out what sort of government Iraq will have once Saddam is thrown out, or give us some idea of what it will cost? And by the way, I asked that question of Condoleezza Rice last Tuesday at a meeting, and it's kind of all up in the air. Can we trust Daschle as a leader if he doesn't challenge the president? Can we trust any of our leaders that what they are basing their decisions on is more than politics, more than ideology? Can we believe them that an explosion of a regional conflict won't result in world instability? Obviously, the market's not so sure of that. Each closing bell of a falling market over the past several weeks is the sound of corporate America, of both large and small shareholders on Wall Street registering a resounding vote of no confidence. They're voting with their wallets, and the message is deep concern. So, church, government, business. Do you see how I identified trust as central to our American future? Please don't misunderstand me. I don't raise these issues as a matter of partisan politics. If I sound like it, that is not my intent. Far from it. Lord knows my party isn't perfect, but that's a whole other speech. If there's one thing you can trust, it is that Jerry Ferraro won't be running for office again. I much prefer working at Golan Harris. Al Golan, I just want you to hear that, and Rich Sternstein, I want you to hear that. So I hope that gives me a certain credibility to make some observations. To me, these questions of trust go far deeper than parties and politics. They reach the roots of our republic. They define the fabric of our freedoms. They are questions that all Americans, of whatever stripe and affiliation, must engage, and that we might all be justifiably concerned about. I never thought that I would live to see a time that our trust in our country would be so deeply questioned. I know that some of you in this room are my age. I ask you to think back. I, for one, cannot recall a time in our national life when so many core pillars of the public trust were so shaky. Even during the Vietnam years and through the Nixon administration, as shattering as both of those things were for America, we did not see the wholesale bargaining of public trust for private profits, the corruption of faith, the threats to physical, national, and economic security that swirl about us now. If we stop and we reflect, we can't fail to see the magnitude of this crisis of confidence in our most basic institutions. So what do? I want to offer a few suggestions to think about. First, let me start with my church. And now I'm going to say something which will undoubtedly have some of you shaking your heads, but hear me out. I am convinced, I truly believe, that if women were admitted to the priesthood, my church would not be in the current crisis. Sure, there might have been pedophiles in the priesthood, but they would have been exposed and removed as soon as the information became available. They would not have been shifted from parish to parish. They would not have been permitted to continue their abuse. There would have been no cover-up. Women are notorious whistleblowers. If you doubt that statement, just think about the two women who recently testified before Congress, Sharon Watkins and Colleen Rowley, the truth tellers at the heart of the other two big scandals of this last year. Watkins wrote a memo to Kenneth Lay warning that Enron would, and I quote her, implode in a wave of accounting scandals. And Rowley wrote to FBI Director Mueller that she had concerns that he and others at the highest levels of FBI management were skewing facts on how the investigation of Moussaoui was handled. Both women risked their own careers to expose the manhandling of trust by their bosses. Both women put honesty and integrity above the institution they work for. And that would have happened if women were priests. If they were in a position of weighing the reputation of the institution, the church, against the safety of children, the children would have won out. I also believe that the men in the hierarchy who are part of the cover-up should resign. I go to church every Sunday. The only time I see a crowd is when I attend Mass when I'm on vacation in the Virgin Islands. Crucians still have confidence in their priests and trust in their church. But here in the mainland, fewer and fewer people are attending Mass. I don't know how it is here in Chicago. I know how it is in Manhattan and in Queens. The greater majority of those who go have gray hair. Is it confidence and trust or habit that keeps old folks going? Is it distrust that keeps young people away? As for the corporate world, well, it's not enough to say police yourself because obviously greed and power get in the way. It's time for government to step up to the plate, and the Sarbanes-Oxley bill, which imposes corporate responsibility and directs the SEC to do oversight, is a good first step. When corporations, even big ones, were owned by families, if the husband stole from the wife or the kids from the parents, it made wonderful headlines in the papers, but it was simply the problems of a dysfunctional family. Today, corporations are owned by stockholders, and those stockholders, in some instances, have their lives invested in the stock, in their stock. Today, 50 million Americans currently are invested in 501k plans. When corporate officers act like thieves, it is the responsibility of government to protect the people and prosecute the offenders. At the same time, corporate leaders have a responsibility to work within their business to help build better governance. Because the values, the culture, and the processes that are in place are far more important than rules and regulations set up by a government. I think that when you get the boards working on their own, when you get the corporate executives talking about values and culture, there are several steps that can be taken by them as well. One is by creating an independent board of directors, rather than, as frequently the case, a board to rubber stamp management decisions. By having a conspicuous disclosure of all details of management, that is, who gets stock options, how those options are reported and recorded, and finally by working out compliance procedures and ethical standards before they end up in court. That list is by no means exhaustive. It is, as I said, just a start. I also believe that institutional investors, in addition to the CEOs and management, should get involved, and they have an obligation to do so. Should get involved to find out before they cast their votes in an election if the companies that they're investing in are following best practices, and if they're not, these institutional investors should make their voices heard. No doubt there are ever-increasing demands to be competitive in a global economy, but these two things are not mutually exclusive. The question should not be how much can I get away with, but rather what is the ethical thing to do. In the long run, that can save a corporation a good deal of money and investors a lot of heartache. Finally, and I'm getting close, we get to government. Despite all the bad news, according to a Gallup poll taken last month, 72% of the public still trust the president, 67% still trust the Congress, but they trust themselves even more, by 78%. A more recent ABC News poll broke the trust factor down a bit to issues. It found that 68% of the public trust government when it comes to national security, but only 38% have confidence that the government can be trusted to handle social issues. I would bet that the White House has read those polls very carefully, with an experienced eye trained on the midterm elections. I would also bet that that's one of the reasons that Iraq has replaced Social Security, corporate corruption, and a sluggish economy as a dominant discussion by Republican politicians all over the country. That's a very dangerous and tricky road to take. Polls are just a snapshot of a particular moment of time. The trust that Gallup measured last month will erode very quickly if the public sees partisan politics overriding good governance. In order for government to hold on to that trust, it is necessary for public officials like corporate officers and church leaders to act ethically and responsibly as they move our national agenda forward. Sometimes that might even mean doing the politically dangerous, like taking the president on issues like Iraq or tax policy when you believe it is in the best interest of this country. Obviously, restoring trust in the post-Enron era is a tall order for my church, for corporate America, for government. Not impossible, but certainly difficult. And maybe we're asking too much. But I believe that if we do not rebuild our ability to trust in each other, in our institution, in our leadership, the brilliant, hopeful dream that is America will be tarnished. We who love this country cannot tolerate that. Thank you, and now I'll take your questions. Okay. Questions or comments? One or the other, or both.
Let's start with Martha Stewart and then the New York, New Jersey.
I have to tell you that Martha Stewart, I have a friend of mine who's a wonderful lawyer, and he's kind of really strange because he's a great defense lawyer, but he has a sense of humor, but you can never tell by looking at him. He was supposed to take off a week in the 4th of July week to take a week's vacation with his family up in Candlewood Lake. His wife, by the way, is a wonderful person, and she was ready for him coming. He calls her up on a Thursday night and he said, "Kathy, I have some good news and I have some bad news." And she said, "So where are you going to start?" He said, "Well, the bad news is I can't come I can't take next week off. I just got a new client in today. I've got to meet with the client on Saturday." And he said, I'm going to be busy because I got to get all the back stuff all put together. I got to really learn the case. And so she said, "So what's the good news?" So he said, "It's Martha Stewart, and she's coming to dinner." Now, You have to know Kathy. Well, first of all, only a man would say something like that with Martha Stewart coming to dinner, because Kathy doesn't care about this stuff. She has a sign up in her kitchen that says, and it's been there for 1,000 years, that says, "I'm no Martha Stewart." And what she did was, this was Thursday night. She found out on Friday. She said, "I'm not cooking for this one." She went out and bought lobsters, made them cold, so she would have a salad. Got salad, and she did just something else that was kind of outrageously expensive. And then she started cleaning the house. That went from top to bottom. And Bob was home in the morning on Saturday. He's never picked up a broom in his entire life. She said, "Sweep and help, get the outside done." She said they went so far as to run off to Home Depot to buy plants for her to put in her garden so that when Martha came, I tell you, it was really funny. And as it was, Martha did come. The only thing she noticed when she came in was their house fronts on the lake, and there's a big picture window when you walk in the door. And she walked in and she said, "Oh, nice view." And then didn't notice anything else. And then did not stay for dinner, though Kathy did offer her when she said, "I'd love you to stay," and she said, "No, she had to get out." You can't blame Martha. I mean, she's focusing on what she's doing. But Kathy said it was the best dinner that Bob had ever had, and she said, "Don't you ever do this to me again." Now, that's my Martha Stewart story. On the New Jersey race, it's going to be craziness. Bob Torricelli, the numbers were terrible, and the ads in New York were unbelievable. Television, I know people play hard politics in this city too, but unbelievable what was coming across. And they were going to be getting worse. And I think that he made the right choice to step down. The problem that they have now is Frank Lattenberg is in. He is 6 points ahead of his opponent, and the opponent is outraged. But you know what? The thing about it is, this isn't the first time that somebody stepped down. And though New Jersey law says 51 days, you can do it for 51 days, you can get a waiver to do it within a shorter period of time. And if you've followed any of this stuff, in 1990, I think it was, in Minnesota, a Republican candidate for governor actually stepped down 8 days before the election, and this person who was the runner-up actually stepped in and won. So I mean, those are the things that are happening in New York, but it's not the only one. I mean, it's craziness what's going on with this negative advertising. It drives me nuts. I'm sorry.
Hi, Herb Sohn. I really enjoyed your talk. It's something I'm particularly interested in. I went to the University of Virginia. As you know, we had an honor system down there. Everything was open. Not only were we thrown out, they only had one thing. You're thrown out if you did something wrong, but if you saw someone who did something wrong,
Yeah.
it didn't say about it, you were asked to leave also. Recently, we had a problem there. They took away diplomas from individuals that plagiarized, their work. The concern that I have is I don't think we're going in early enough to talk to kids in schools about, I happen to teach, I'm a doctor just like your daughter, and I teach at medical school. I teach ethics programs, things like that. I don't think we're going in early enough in the school system to teach kids about honesty. And it seems to me this is a program that really should be early on. And I think if people were taught how important it was to be honest, I think would be a lot better off. As an example, you may not know this, and your daughter may not know this, when Wilbur Cohn wrote the Medicare program under Johnson when he was head of HEW, he didn't put in an inspector general because he felt physicians were so honest they didn't need it. 2 years later, and as a physician, I'm telling you this, 2 years later we have the biggest IG program in the country on fraud and abuse. It seems to me that if we can get early and talk to our school system a little bit early and show people how it pays to be honest, I think we'll be a lot better off. Just a comment.
I agree with you, but I have to tell you, I would also hope the parents might do a little bit of that themselves.
No, I'm
I mean,
talking about the whole system.
Yeah, I think that's a problem. At one time, Professor Rimini is a Fordham University college teacher at one time. He was there when I was in the night school. When I was there, they did not have ethics courses in the law school. Now, Fordham University is probably, and has been for the past maybe 25 years, is a leader in ethics courses, and the continuing legal education, which all of us lawyers have to continue to do, 24 credits every 2 years, a portion of those have to be ethics courses. Now, does that mean that all lawyers are ethical? No. We certainly know that. But the point is that you do have to teach it, and it's being done there. I think also my daughter in medical school also took a medical
They do,
ethics
yes.
course now. I think it's important that we do it in the professional schools, but I think it's important that kids understand about honesty and integrity, and I would hope that that's being taught. I mean, looking at role models, I think is important. And looking at people stand up for things that they believe in. I mean, you can go back to Rosa Parks, who, if that's not somebody who believed in what she was doing, and Martin Luther King, I mean, and then go the gamut. I mean, all the way back. I keep pointing to people who are either women or minorities, but if you go back to Susan B. Anthony, I mean, the things that they stood up for and were ridiculed for, but they believed in it. And they're not the only ones. Look at the people who have been the activists in environmental issues and on war issues or peace issues, and down the line. So I think those are things that we have to, in some measures, obviously teach at home. We have to teach by example in society, and hopefully I think we can. There might be a time when we could turn around and say, the bottom line, the fact that you can do something doesn't mean that you should, and it gets into a whole different place. But I agree with you. Any other questions, comments?
Hi, Jerry. Joel Cohen,
Hi, Joe.
City Club member. Would you be able to share with us your insight as far as this situation that has arisen under this administration where Arthur Anderson is
I'm
gutted?
having trouble hearing you.
Okay.
And that's like New
All right.
York, too. Speak more closely
Yeah,
into the mic.
I was asking you if you could share your insight into why this administration would choose to gut an Arthur Anderson where it's clear that where a few people were involved in some wrongdoing, or possibly even an Enron, which hurts both employees as well as shareholders.
Well, it's. I mean, when you take a look at what's happened with Enron, there are lots of people who are going to be responsible on the thing. Enron is a done deal. I mean, look at what the stock is. What, 9 cents, 6 cents before it went totally gone? From I forgot what it was, $50 some odd a piece. There are lots of people who lost a lot of money. What else do you do with it? Do you go back and boost it up again? That's not where it can be, unfortunately. I think the only thing you can do in that situation is go after the people who did this. I think also, reaction of government with additional regulations. I think they've got to go to the board of directors too. How does that happen? And I've served on a couple of boards. I serve on a lot of not-for-profits, but I served on a couple of for-profit. You have to be able to question what's going on. How did they allow that to get away? And I think that board members have to be held responsible beyond the insurance covering them. They have to be responsible in perhaps a criminal prosecution on some of those people. So I don't think the administration had a choice with Enron. I don't think they could go there and back them up or boost them up. I mean, it's not as if Chrysler is going to go bankrupt and they're coming and asking for a loan. Could you help us survive, which we did in 1980. It's a different thing. And now you have the airlines asking for help. But there are lots of pieces that are out there that did not exist in Enron with these other corporations. So, I mean, I think you have a problem with administration boosting them up or helping them out of their trouble. And I don't think there's very much the administration can do, and I can't believe that I'm defending the administration.
Yeah, I wasn't suggesting that the administration would boost them up. It just seems as though there's some overkill that has occurred. You were a prosecutor. You prosecute those who are criminal. You don't gut an entire organization.
Well, I think by prosecuting the ones who are criminal, it's going to impact on the corporation itself, obviously. I mean, how far down the line do you go at Enron? You've got to go to where the trouble started. And if the trouble started with the CEO, the CFO, the board of directors, and down the line, you go to every single one. Everybody should be punished who did something wrong that created this havoc. And if that destroys the company, who's suffered? It's the one they're suffering not because the company is falling apart at this point, the shareholders. They're suffering because their stock went from a high down to nothing, and they've been left with nothing. I mean, in some ways, I think, I'm not I'm not no longer practicing law, but it seems to me that, going after these guys, I have no sympathy for somebody who's got all these, got millions and millions of dollars, and they're hiding it and complaining that they have to sell some of their stuff in order to Mrs. Lay, I'm talking about, who had to sell some of her stuff at auction or whatever she did. She did one of these little thrift shop type of things, boutiques. But how do you have sympathy? I think you wipe them out totally and get some of that money out to the people. I sound heartless, don't I? I mean, it's just, the thing about it is there are too many people who are suffering. I've seen this. I mean, I've had people come up to me and said, I've lost everything. They still think I'm in office and can do something about it, but it's amazing. This book that Steve was talking about, it's no longer in print, so I'm not talking, it was just Framing a Life. I talk about my mother, my grandmother, because I want to talk about the values that I was raised in, and the values of, it wasn't only my family, it was all immigrant families. When they came over here, they had nothing, and, at the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th. And, they were honest, they were hardworking. My grandmother, when my grandfather had a stroke, they were very, very poor. Could have applied for home relief, they called it then, and she just wouldn't do it. And she did something which I thought was stupid. Her pride made her send my mother and my mother was the one more than the others. My mother out to work when she was 13. So my mother couldn't get the education that she wanted, and when she was 84, that was a big thing, that she never was able to have a formal education. When you think about what members of Congress do, and senators or candidates or things, what they do is they get on the phone and they beg. And I used to say, my grandmother, my mother must be spinning in their graves. It is so demeaning. I cannot tell you how demeaning it is to get on and cold call people you don't know, get through. I mean, I invariably get through to people. But then, to get them when they're often, you're having sometimes inane conversations. The focus is, well, you send a check, and it's always at the end of the word. The guy sends it to somebody they've seen maybe on television. It is demeaning. It is time-consuming. Tell me how a senator who's in, well, that's not even as bad as a member of Congress who runs every 2 years. If they're on the phone raising money up the kazoo because they're running for office and they've got to do it day after day after, when are they doing the job that they're supposed to be elected to? I mean, I find it mind-boggling that it's such a waste of time. Now, what's better? We've had some campaign finance reform, and I think that that's good. But I have always said that I really think public financing is the way to go. But it's not only public financing. It also has to be that the press has to be involved with it. And this drives people up crazy. If you were to say to the networks that you must give, or local television, whatever, and there has to be a way to work this out, that you have to contribute some time as a public service to meaningful debates instead of all the negative advertising. Can you imagine how terrific if we actually voted for somebody because of what they were going to do or because of their experience and what they've done, not because of somebody saying something horrendous about them personally? That could make a difference. We have public financing in New York in our city elections, and it's not perfect. And yeah, you do have a lot of candidates, but it's okay because they're not doing the fundraising. They're not wasting their time when they're in office doing the fundraising, and I think that that's terrific. The other point, I think, with all of this is that even with public financing, even if you had all this, the public going on, you still have a question of incumbency, which is a very strong re-election boon that people have, and I don't know if there's any way to get out of that. It's the only way it seems to be able to get over it, which is a whole other different discussion, is by somebody putting in millions and millions and millions of their own dollars, and that's a problem. So campaign finance reform is not an easy thing to deal with, but should be dealt with. One last one.
My name is Edna Epstein. I'm also a City Club member. I'd like to come back to the Enron issue. It strikes me that criminal prosecution alone, however demeaning and humiliating, probably is not enough, particularly if you come out of jail in 2 or 3 years from Club Fed and still have $100 million stashed away. are there mechanisms in place, both criminally and civilly, to really do across-the-board restitution from a lot of these people, and not just the upper-level ones, but the fellows they brought along with them?
I think that with a lot of these criminal prosecutions, a lot of those judges will look to imposing fines that are going to go a long way to wiping out the hundreds of millions of dollars that some of these people have accumulated. But the other thing, too, is I suspect we're going to see some sort of class action suits against some of these people. I don't, who knows how much they'll get. And the frustrating thing is when you see your, a 401k go from, value that's $10,000 down to being worth $5. I mean, you turn around and say, oh, God, he'll never get it back, or she'll never get it back. But there are other remedies, and I assume that we're going to see those over a period of time. And by the way, the person mentioned Arthur Andersen, and going after Arthur Andersen, I mean, and making sure that people who are doing auditing are not at the same time acting as investment bankers. I mean, that's a good thing. You have a conflict. And I think that those are the things that you have to also take a look at. So, in any event, I've totally enjoyed being with all of you. Thank you so much for having me here today.
Congresswoman Ferraro, in compliance with all these ethics ordinances that you guys pass down there, and they pass here every week in the City Council, we want to present to you a membership to the City Club of Chicago. Just hold on. There's more coming. This, too, is within the $50 ethics ordinance. This is a city... oh, okay. Okay, feel free. Yeah. A City Club mug and a special gift we have for you. Copies of today's Chicago Sun-Times, so you can join the 500,000 other readers that read this piece this morning. Only if Steve wanted. I bet you he'd do it. As a matter of fact,
There you go.
while he's autographing it, let's give him a round of applause. Thank you very, very much.